In our 300 or so thousand years of existence, humans have always found an excuse to kill each other. For all that talk about humans being more intelligent in the animal kingdom, we seem to give into our primitive instincts at every opportunity. That explains why history is littered with records of so many conflicts. However, one of these conflicts stands out from the others, not in the way it started, but in how effectively these humans killed each other. About 1 million lives taken in not 2 years, not in 1 year, not even in 6 months, but in 100 days. And to think this started from good old jealousy. So it's the late 1800s, and every major European power wants a piece of this newly discovered pie, which is Africa. One of such powers was Germany, and if you were wondering, it's not the one ruled by the guy with the funny mustache. This was the newly formed German Empire. Somehow, the always quarreling German state had managed to unite into a single empire, and there was no way they were going to miss out on all the free stuff in Africa. Anyway, because Africa was one really big pie, the European powers needed some sort of sharing formula to make sure no one goes dipping his hand into other slices. This sharing formula was discussed at the 1884 Berlin Conference, and as you guessed, no African leader was invited. Why invite the real owners of the land when you can just take it from them? That's probably what the European powers thought, and they were right. In the years that followed the Berlin Conference, Africa was gradually carved up into different territories by European powers, with France and England having the largest share. The German Empire managed to secure a chunk of land in East Africa. These territories encompass present-day Burundi, Tanzania, Namibia, and finally, Rwanda. Rwanda was quite different from most African countries because it had just 3 ethnic groups: the Hutu, who made up about 84% of the population, the Tutsi about 15%, and the Twa about 1%. Thinking about it, you'd expect the Hutus to entirely dominate Rwanda, control the government, and maybe one day even try to eliminate the other groups. Well, you couldn't be any further from the truth, except for maybe that last bit. Because while the Hutus took a large share of the population, they weren't exactly leadership material. Leadership generally fell into the Tutsis, who had ruled the Kingdom of Rwanda through succession of chiefs years before German occupation. Now, imagine you are a Hutu, seeing your tribe constantly dominated and ruled for years by a much smaller tribe. Do you just ignore it, or you start to build some sort of resentment? After all, who made the Tutsis lord over you? And that was just one of the many questions in the mind of the Hutus. However, it was just the beginning of the Tutsis' dominance. Because if the Hutus thought it was unfair that they weren't allowed to be rulers, then how does segregation sound? That's right. Within a few years of German control over Rwanda, the nation would evolve into a state that supported segregation against the Hutus. And although it wasn't anything like South Africa's apartheid, there were still some similarities. It's hard to actually pinpoint when it started, but it was likely right after Germany got their ass handed to them in World War I. Now, if you weren't too familiar with how the war works, when you lose in war, a lot of things happen. But one thing that almost always happens is that you lose a ton of land. In Germany's case, it meant that they had to give up their East African colonies to the Allies, especially to Belgium. The Belgians weren't exactly colonizers of the year. They had a long list of crimes in the Congo, and with the new colony in their hands, it was business as usual. Seeing as the approach in the Congo had been attracting a lot of bad reviews, plus the vicious King Leopold II was now resting 6 feet under, the Belgians did something different. They used the Tutsis to rule Rwanda in a form of indirect rule, and with that came the privileges for the Tutsis. They got to attend the fancier schools, better hospitals, and were even considered generally closer to Europeans. Shocking, right? Well, the Tutsis lapped up that lie like a child eating ice cream. In actual fact, they weren't any closer to Europeans than the Hutus or the Twa. The Belgians just found out to be a convenient lie to keep them in line, and it worked brilliantly. Speaking of the Hutus, they didn't get any preferential treatment. Well, except for counting the terrible schools or facilities they got access to, they had especially been sidelined despite having a whopping 85% of the population in favor of the Tutsis. But here was the catch. It was possible for the Hutu, who had attained significant wealth, to become a honorary Tutsi. Besides, being a Tutsi just meant you had an insane number of cows. Now, while this kind of upward mobility meant that not all the Hutus were hopeless, it was also created to keep the Hutus poor. The reasoning was simple. If a Hutu ever became wealthy enough to try to threaten Tutsi dominance, make him into a Tutsi, and suddenly he isn't that much of a threat again. It was divide and conquer at its finest. The Belgians took things up a notch when they introduced identity cards that included ethnicity in 1932. While all this was happening, the Hutus were watching with increasing anger. All that resentment towards the Tutsis had generally built up into a strong hatred, strong enough for them to want to unalive every living Tutsi. All they needed was an opportunity and perhaps provocation too. Surprisingly, it didn't take too long for that to happen. If you know a lot about African history, you'd have heard how important the 1950s were. It was where Africans started to realize they didn't have to take orders from some white man, that they could actually rule themselves. Generally, Africa faced a wave of independence movements in the 1950s. The Hutus saw this and recognized an opportunity, one that could potentially change their fortune, and maybe even allow them to take revenge against those pesky Tutsis. They realized that if they could be at the forefront of independence movement, when the Belgians eventually get tired and decide to pack up shop, they could gain control of the government. In 1959, the Hutus revolted against the Belgian colonies and Tutsi rulers, forcing the Belgians to reallocate power to them. It didn't stop there, however. The Hutus also murdered some Tutsi elites, and around 120,000 Tutsis had fled Rwanda for fear of the Hutus. Naturally, they fled into neighboring countries like Uganda and Burundi. The Hutus finally had what they wanted: control over the government, and even better, they had managed to get the Tutsis under control. All that remained was to attain independence, and that came fairly easy. By 1962, 3 years after the Hutu revolt, Belgium decided it was time to let Rwanda rule themselves. Independence meant the Hutus could do whatever they liked, and that included a widespread discrimination against the Tutsis. The Tutsis were not allowed in prominent careers, and education quota limited Tutsi access to quality education. It was basically payback time for the Hutus, and it resulted directly in the exodus of more than 300,000 Tutsis from Rwanda. The Tutsis had basically been reduced to second-class citizens in their own country. This built up resentment between the Hutus and the Tutsis. They had gone from bickering about who deserved to rule to outrightly murdering each other. Ethnically motivated violence became quite common in Rwanda, especially with the formation of the Tutsi group, the Rwandan Patriotic Front. The RPF was the Tutsis' response to Hutu bullying. They conducted regular attacks on Hutu civilians and the government. Whether that was effective or not is debatable, because the RPF attacks were usually followed by retaliatory attacks on random Tutsi civilians. Still, that kept things balanced at least for a while. Then, the military came around. Like almost every other African country post-independence, Rwanda faced a lot of problems, like poor infrastructure and financial mismanagement. Gregory Kayibanda's government was, in essence, failing. The army watched on the sideline as Rwanda had gone from a very promising country to living off IMF hand-me-downs, and in July 1973, they struck. Kayibanda was replaced by Defense Minister Major General Juvino Habyarimana, a moderate Hutu, which was just a fancy term for a Hutu that's less likely to murder Tutsis. As you would expect, the new government came with the promise of righting the wrongs of the previous government, and you can already guess how that went. At first, it seemed like a new government was all about national unity and maintaining peace in a country that had been so divided along the lines of ethnicity and regionalism. If you are wondering, the previous government was all about not promoting unity. Sure, they scapegoated Tutsis most of the time, but even among Hutus, things weren't exactly rosy. The Hutus in the north and the ones in the south constantly fought over who should hold more power, and the previous government's favoritism towards southern Hutus annoyed the northern ones. So, many expected that the new government would change a lot of things. Even the Tutsis hoped for change, and maybe that was their first mistake. You see, while the new government's initial plan seemed all about unity and putting Rwanda back on track, it was soon clear that Tutsis had no relevance to them. Absolutely none. Education opportunities for Tutsis were very limited, and they had no place in government. In fact, leadership positions were mostly reserved for Hutus from the north, and for a while, the government seemed to work almost perfectly. The economy got better, and Rwandans enjoyed a better quality of life, maybe except the Tutsis. Anyway, after 10 years of growth, things started to look very bad once again. The incessant power struggle and favoritism gradually destabilized the government, until eventually the government was nothing more than a bunch of Juvenal Habyarimana's family and a handful of loyalists. Rwanda had in fact been transformed into a monarchy-style government, and you know what this meant for the country. Posts were more filled based on whoever could stay loyal rather than who could actually do the job. So the economy tanked. But guess who was to blame for it? Well, the Tutsis. Since the government had no quick fix to the country's problems, they embarked on a massive propaganda campaign with a single aim: blame the Tutsis for everything and anything bad. It was oddly similar to how Hitler blamed the Jews for everything that was wrong in Germany. Whether it was straight out of Hitler's playbook or it was just born out of sheer hatred for the Tutsis, it actually worked. For a species that could possess massive intellectual capacity, humans are always quick to blame someone else for their problems, or at least accept that lie. The Hutus in this case outrightly accepted the Tutsis to be the cause of their problems without any proof. The Hutu government also prevented Tutsis who had previously fled Rwanda from returning. In 1990, with increasing hostility toward Tutsis, a faction of the RPF, mostly Tutsis who now held notable positions in the Ugandan army, invaded Rwanda, sparking a civil war. Their aim was to take over the government and restore Tutsi dominance. Led by Paul Kagame, the RPF attacked various military and civilian targets in Rwanda. In the meantime, the Rwandan government continued their anti-Tutsi propaganda. Many wealthy Hutus loyal to the president helped to fuel the war by supplying weapons, providing logistics, and funding militia training. And when the guns ran out, they armed the Interahamwe and other militias with machetes and nail-studded clubs. The Interahamwe were basically a Hutu extremist militia, and they would play a major part in the genocide a few years later. As war continued, the Hutu government continued their propagandist messages, demonizing Tutsis using TV and newspapers owned by wealthy Hutus, particularly Radio Television Libre de Miles Collins, and the Kangura newspaper became the mouthpiece of the Hutu extremists to demonize all Tutsis as the principal enemy. Anyone who dared to sympathize with Tutsis or support them was seen as a partisan enemy. In essence, Tutsis and anyone associated with them had a target on their back. While it's hard to actually explain why the Hutus believed this kind of propaganda, it's fair to say that it was mostly down to desperation, fear, and maybe some deep-rooted hatred. Their economy was tanking, prices soared, and now they had to fight a war. Helpless, frustrated, and desperately looking for a solution, the Hutu population believed whatever propaganda they heard. However, after 3 years of fighting, the Hutu government decided to sue for peace. Talks began between the government and the RPF, resulting in the Arusha Peace Accords. The agreement was based on the settlement of thousands of Tutsi refugees and a more inclusive political model that abolished the one-party state model and allowed for more political parties. In the aftermath of the war, about 15 new political parties sprang up, but the war had left a lasting impact on the country's politics. Political violence had been normalized and virtually every political party was associated with its own militia. The Interahamwe had also spent the most part of the war distributing weapons among the population and spreading Tutsi hate, almost as if they were preparing for a big attack on the Tutsis. On one hand, the war was over. On the other, anti-Tutsi propaganda continued in full force. The government wasted no time in politicizing ethnicity, usually bringing up colonial segregation and using that fear to control the Hutu population. This would set the stage for the 1994 genocide. Like every conflict in history, the genocide in Rwanda had to be triggered by something. Perhaps an event significant enough to turn all that pent-up anger into murderous action. That event was the death of Rwandan president. On April 6, 1994, a plane containing the Rwandan and Burundi president was shot down in Kigali. Although it's still unclear who was behind that attack, the Rwanda government, heavy with an anti-Tutsi sentiment, got to work. Local media blamed the RPF and the Tutsis for the murder of the two presidents, asking the Hutus to get to work, and work they did. Within hours, moderate Hutu politicians who were against the killing of the Tutsis were murdered. The Prime Minister, a moderate Hutu herself, was murdered in a UN volunteer compound the next morning. The 10 Belgian soldiers sent to protect her were powerless against the might of the entire Rwandan presidential guard, who had apparently turned against her. The Belgian soldiers too suffered similar fates. Working off a long list of targets, the army and various militias moved from house to house, murdering Tutsis and moderate Hutus. Soldiers opened fire on crowd of Tutsis, while angry Hutu militias went from house to house, using machetes and clubs to hack at Tutsi and any Hutu offering them shelter. They perpetrated acts of physical and sexual violence with no regard for women and children. It was so terrible that sometimes victims were forced into large open areas and then soldiers opened fire on them. Fearing for their lives, hundreds of Tutsis took refuge in churches and schools, hoping and waiting for international communities to intervene. Sadly, help didn't come. As UN withdrew all active personnel in the wake of the attacks, the Tutsis were murdered in their numbers while the international community stood by and let it happen. The killings continued until 100 days later when the RPF seized Kigali and essentially took over the government. It's estimated that between 800,000 to 1 million Rwandans died in the 100-day violence, and only a small number of Tutsis were left alive. It's hard to imagine what would have happened to the rest of the Tutsis had the RPF not intervened. In the aftermath of the genocide, the new government led by President Paul Kagame focused on trying the perpetrators of the genocide. On the other hand, the UN established the International Criminal Tribunal in November 1994. The court focused on trying high-profile politicians behind the genocide. In total, the UN courts tried 61 people. However, the Rwandan court had it a lot harder. There were about 150,000 Rwandans awaiting trial. Due to the damage of the judicial infrastructure and the need to speed up the trial, most cases were tried in informal traditional courts. Using the Gacaca system, the cases were divided into categories: planning and inciting genocide and sexual abuse, physical attacks leading to grievous bodily harm, and finally, looting or other property crimes. The system used local witnesses as the acceptable form of evidence. These witnesses would speak for or against the accused, and then appointed traditional judges would determine an appropriate sentence. The system helped the government move through the enormous backlog in a short time, but it came with its flaws. Many potential witnesses were intimidated. Some people weren't willing to accuse their neighbors publicly, and some of the judges were believed to be Hutu sympathizers. The trials also faced one major criticism, because while it prosecuted perpetrators of the genocide, it only seemed to focus on the violence against the Tutsis. In total, around 1.7 people stood trial in the courts, with sentences ranging from community service to long prison terms and even death by firing squad for the most serious offenses. By 2012, the trials that had lasted more than a decade were concluded. However, public opinion on the trials differed. For some, it was necessary for them to find closure for the act of violence against their loved ones. For others, the trials were a reminder of a past they wanted to forget. Today, Rwanda stands tall as one of Africa's most stable and fast-developing countries. Having moved on from its darkest hour, and while the current government may have its flaws, the chances of that horror show ever happening again is as low as it can get.